Hook. The cowboy had one chance to keep his ranch, but the woman standing beside the train tracks was the one thing he refused to lose. Thomas Reed stood in the cold wind, holding the papers that could decide the future of Red Willow Ranch. Clara's old suitcase rested beside her as the train whistle echoed through the valley, and she reached for the door before he said the words she never expected to hear. But why was this lonely woman ready to leave the only place that ever felt like home? Stay with us and discover her story. The freight wagon rolled into Red Willow just as the afternoon sun began slipping behind the Wind River Mountains. The wheels creaked over the frozen dirt road. A thin layer of dust clung to the wooden boards, the horses breathing clouds into the cold Wyoming air. Clara Whitfield stepped down slowly, one hand holding the worn leather handle of her suitcase, the other holding a folded letter that had carried her across hundreds of miles. The letter was the reason she had come. A position in the respectable household outside town. Cooking, cleaning, keeping things in order. The kind of work Clara knew better than anything else. She had spent years making other people's homes comfortable. She knew how to keep a fire alive before dawn. She knew how to stretch flour through a long winter. She knew how to mend a torn sleeve so carefully that the owner would forget it had ever been damaged. But she had never had a place where someone waited for her return. Clara walked through Red Willow with her suitcase beside her, following the address written on the letter. The town was small, the kind of place where everyone knew the sound of every wagon that passed through. Wooden buildings lined the main street. A blacksmith worked behind an open shop door. The smell of coffee and smoke drifted from the small restaurant near the corner. She reached the house before sunset. A woman answered the door. For a moment, Clara thought she had simply arrived too early. Then she saw the woman's eyes move from the letter in her hand to Clara's face. "I'm sorry," the woman said quietly. "The arrangement has changed." Clara stood still. "Changed?" The woman looked uncomfortable. "My husband doesn't think it's wise anymore. With the town talking and all." She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Clara had heard enough unfinished sentences in her life to understand them. She folded the letter carefully, not angrily, not sadly, just carefully. "Thank you for letting me know." The woman closed the door. Clara stood there a moment longer, the sound of the latch settling into place almost louder than it should have been. Then she picked up her suitcase. She had been in this position before. A new town, a new house, a new reason why there was no room for her after all. By the time she reached the small boarding house near the center of Red Willow, the sky had turned gray. She placed her suitcase down beside the porch steps and knocked. The owner opened the door only halfway. "We're full." Clara looked past him. There were empty hooks by the entrance, an unused chair near the wall. She noticed, but she only nodded. "I understand." The door closed. The cold wind moved through the street. Clara remained standing there, holding the handle of the suitcase that contained nearly everything she owned. She had learned long ago not to argue with closed doors. A horse approached from the edge of town, slow steps, steady. The rider wore a dark coat covered in dust from the trail, a wide hat shadowing his face. He slowed when he saw her standing alone. Thomas Reed had spent the last 3 hours checking fence lines on the northern edge of Red Willow Ranch. He had ridden through enough winters to understand when something looked out of place, and a woman standing beside a suitcase after sunset, in a town that offered no welcome, was something he noticed. He stopped his horse. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Thomas removed his gloves. "Ma'am." Clara looked up. His voice was calm, not curious, not searching for a story, just calm. "Do you have somewhere warm to stay tonight?" It was a simple question, but Clara was not used to simple kindness. She adjusted her grip on the suitcase. "I'll manage." Thomas looked toward the boarding house, then back at her. He seemed to understand that "I'll manage" was not an answer. It was something people said when when they had learned not to expect help. "I run Red Willow Ranch," he said. "We're short a kitchen hand." Clara watched him carefully. There was no pity in his voice, no promise, no attempt to make himself look like a hero, only an offer. "I can work," she said. "I figured you could." The answer surprised her. Most men who offered help wanted something explained first. Thomas simply turned his horse around. "The ranch is about 4 miles north. You can start tomorrow morning. I'll pay you every month, same as anyone else." Clara picked up her suitcase. "Thank you, Mr. Reed." He nodded once. "Thomas." She looked at him. Thomas Reed, a small thing, a name offered without demand. She followed him out of town as the last light disappeared behind the mountains. Red Willow Ranch sat in a wide valley surrounded by dark hills and open grassland. The buildings were practical and strong. A barn stood near the corral. The main house was made from thick timber, built to withstand Wyoming winters. When Clara stepped inside, she noticed the first thing immediately. The house was clean, very clean, but it was quiet. Too quiet. There were no flowers near the windows, no extra dishes on the shelf, no signs that another person had ever chosen the color of a curtain or left a book on a table. It felt like a house built by someone who knew how to survive, not someone who knew how to live. Thomas showed her the kitchen. "The stove works better if you keep the fire low overnight." Clara nodded. She noticed the small details, the coffee pot beside the stove, the neatly stacked wood, the empty chair at the table. Everything had a place, except warmth. "The room is there," Thomas said, pointing toward a small space beside the kitchen. Clara walked over. Her hand touched the curtain hanging between the kitchen and the small corner. Inside was a narrow bed, a small wooden chest, a hook for her coat. It was not terrible. Many people would have called it comfortable, but Clara knew exactly what it was: a place close enough to work, a place easy enough to leave, a place that reminded her she was not part of the house. She stood quietly. For a moment, memories came back, small rooms behind kitchens, thin blankets, packing her belongings before someone told her it was time to go. Thomas noticed her silence. "You need anything else?" Clara looked back at him. "No, sir." Thomas waited. Something in her expression made him pause. But Clara had already placed her suitcase beside the bed. She had learned not to ask for more than what was offered. Thomas nodded. "Breakfast starts at 5. The ranch hands eat early. I'll be ready." He walked away. The door closed softly behind him. That night, Clara lay awake listening to the wind moving through the valley. The ranch was warmer than any place she had slept in for years. The bed was softer, the walls were stronger, but she still kept her suitcase near the door, just in case. Because Clara Whitfield had spent her whole life learning one thing: a person could build comfort anywhere. But belonging was something much harder to find. For the first few weeks at Red Willow Ranch, Clara Whitfield did what she had always done. She learned. She learned the sound of the ranch before sunrise, the heavy footsteps of men leaving the bunkhouse, the creak of leather saddles being tightened, the sharp whistle of the wind moving down from the Wind River Mountains before the first light touched the valley. She learned which cowboy liked his coffee strong, and which one added a spoonful of sugar when he thought nobody was watching. She learned where the flour was stored, which cabinet door stuck in the damp weather, and how long the old stove needed before it gave a steady flame. Clara did not arrive trying to change anything. She simply noticed what was missing. The first morning, the men ate quietly. A plate of eggs, some bread, coffee poured into tin cups. They were grateful, but they were not used to being cared for. Men who spent their days under the open sky often learned to ignore small discomforts: a torn glove, a cough that lasted too long, a sore shoulder. They carried those things the same way they carried dust on their boots. Clara noticed anyway. Thomas Reed watched from the doorway of the kitchen that morning. He said nothing. He had hired a cook. He had not expected someone who remembered every man's name by the end of the week. Sam Carter was the first one who made his opinion clear. The old cowboy sat at the corner of the dining table with his hat beside him and his arms crossed. "This place has run just fine for years," he said. Clara looked up from the bread she was cutting. "Then I suppose my job is to make sure it keeps running." Sam studied her. He was not used to answers that did not carry anger. Most people either argued with him or avoided him. Clara did neither. She simply placed another plate on the table. "You should eat before the coffee gets cold, Mr. Carter." Sam grumbled something under his breath, but he picked up his fork. A week later, Clara noticed he was barely touching his food, not because he disliked it, because he was hurting. When she saw him pressing his jaw while working outside near the corral, she understood. That evening, instead of asking questions, Clara placed a bowl of warm soup in front of him. Sam looked down. "What is this? Something soft." "I didn't ask for soft." "No," Clara said, "but you needed it." The old cowboy looked like he wanted to argue, then he smelled the soup. For a moment, his expression changed. "My mother used to make something close to this." Clara folded the cloth in her hands. "Then I hope I got it right." Sam looked at the bowl for a long time. The next morning, he was the first man in the kitchen. Not because he was hungry, because he had something to say. "Coffee's better today." Clara glanced over. "Was yesterday's bad?" Sam looked away. No, it was the closest thing to a compliment anyone at the ranch had ever heard from him. After that, things began to shift. Slowly, quietly. The bunkhouse changed before anyone admitted it. The men stayed at the table a little longer after meals. Someone brought in fresh apples from town. Another fixed the loose shelf near the stove without being asked. The ranch hands who once ate in silence began telling stories about old trails and forgotten towns. The kitchen became the warmest room at Red Willow, and Thomas Reed noticed. Every evening, after the work was done, he would stand outside the kitchen door for a moment, not entering, just listening. He heard laughter, something he had not heard inside those walls in years. One night, Clara found him standing there. "You need something, Mr. Reed?" Thomas looked slightly caught off guard. "No." She waited, then he looked toward the kitchen. "You changed the place." Clara lowered her eyes. "I only cooked dinner." Thomas shook his head. "No," his voice was quiet. "You gave these men somewhere to come back to." The words stayed between them. Clara did not know what to say. Nobody had ever described her work that way before, not as labor, not as something temporary, as something that mattered. The following week, a cold wind came down from the mountains, the kind that found every crack in every wall. Clara woke before dawn and noticed the small room beside the kitchen was colder than usual. The old wooden door did not close properly. A thin line of winter air slipped through the frame. She placed a folded blanket against it and continued with breakfast. She forgot about the door. Thomas did not. That afternoon, while Clara was preparing supper, she heard the sound of a hammer outside. When she stepped out, Thomas was kneeling beside the doorway. He had removed the old hinges and was fitting new ones. His coat was dusted with wood shavings. "You didn't have to do that," Clara said. Thomas kept working. "I know." She looked at him. He tightened the last screw, tested the door, then stood. The new frame closed perfectly. The wind stayed outside. Thomas rested one hand on the door for a moment. Nobody here should sleep where the wind can reach them. Clara looked at the door, then at him. It was a small thing. A repaired hinge, a stronger piece of wood, something most people would never remember. But Clara had spent years sleeping in places where nobody noticed if she was cold. Nobody noticed if she was comfortable. Nobody noticed if she stayed. She touched the edge of the new door carefully. "Thank you, Thomas." He nodded once, then he walked away before the moment became something either of them had to explain. That night, Clara sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the small room. The walls were still simple, the furniture was still plain, but for the first time in years, she closed a door behind her knowing it was not just a place where she worked. And outside that door, somewhere in the quiet of Red Willow Ranch, there was a man who had noticed when the wind got in. Spring came slowly to the Wind River Valley. The snow along the fence lines melted little by little, leaving dark patches of earth beneath the old cottonwood trees. The mornings were still cold enough to see breath in the air, but by afternoon the sun warmed the wooden porches and brought the sound of cattle moving across the open fields. Life at Red Willow Ranch settled into a rhythm, and somewhere between the early mornings and long evenings, something changed. Not suddenly, not loudly, just enough that Thomas Reed began noticing things he had trained himself not to see. A second cup beside the coffee pot, the sound of Clara humming quietly while she worked. The way the kitchen window stayed open for a few minutes every morning, because she liked the smell of fresh air before the stove heated the room. Small things, the kind of things he had forgotten mattered. Thomas had spent years believing a man could build his life around work. A ranch, a herd, a good fence, a strong roof, things that stayed where you put them. People were different. People could leave. He knew that better than most. But Clara Whitfield had a way of making herself part of a place without ever asking permission. One evening, Thomas returned late from checking the southern pasture. The sun had already disappeared behind the mountains, painting the sky a deep orange. He found a cup of coffee sitting on the edge of the kitchen table, still warm. He looked around. Clara was standing near the stove, folding a clean cloth. "You didn't have to wait up," he said. She looked over. "I wasn't waiting." Thomas glanced at the coffee. A small smile almost appeared on his face. "Right." Clara looked down, hiding her own smile. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them no longer felt empty. That was new. As the months passed, Thomas and Clara began talking more. Not about important things at first, the weather, the cattle, the price of supplies in town. Then slowly, the conversations became something else. One evening, they sat on this porch after the ranch hands had gone to sleep. The lantern beside them flickered in the cool night air. Thomas held his coffee with both hands. "I used to think silence was easier." Clara looked toward the dark fields. "Easier than what?" He took a long breath. "Easier than missing someone." She turned toward him. Thomas did not look at her. His eyes stayed on the valley. "My wife and I came here thinking we'd grow old on this land." His voice remained steady, but his fingers tightened slightly around the cup. Then one winter took her away. The wind moved through the grass. Clara did not interrupt. That was one thing Thomas had come to appreciate about her. She never rushed into empty spaces just because they were quiet. After a moment, he continued, "After that, I figured the ranch was enough." Clara looked at the house behind them. The ranch was never the thing that was missing. Thomas finally looked at her. Their eyes met, and for a few seconds, neither of them looked away. A week later, Clara shared something she had never told anyone at Red Willow. She was sitting at the kitchen table repairing a torn sleeve. "My whole life, I've lived in rooms where I knew exactly how long I was allowed to stay." Thomas leaned against the counter. "What do you mean?" She carefully pulled the thread through the fabric. Every place had rules. Her voice was quiet. "Do the work. Keep things clean. Don't ask for too much." The needle stopped moving. When people don't know if they'll be welcome tomorrow, they learn not to get comfortable today. Thomas looked at her hands. Hands that had fixed clothes, cooked meals, cared for people who probably never knew how much she gave. You shouldn't have had to live that way. Clara gave a small smile. You can't change where someone came from. No, Thomas said. Then he paused. But maybe you can change where they stay. The words stayed in the room. Clara looked at him. Thomas seemed almost surprised that he had said them. Not everyone in Red Willow saw Clara the way Thomas did. In town, people noticed things. They noticed that Thomas Reed spent more evenings near the kitchen. They noticed that Clara had become someone the ranch depended on, and some people did not know what to make of it. Evelyn Hart, the woman who owned the general store, watched quietly when Clara came in for supplies. She was not cruel, but she believed the world worked best when everyone stayed in the place society had already decided for them. You've settled in well, Evelyn said while writing down the order. Clara nodded. Mr. Reed has been fair. Evelyn glanced up. Thomas is a good man, a pause. But a good man has responsibilities. Clara understood the meaning behind the words. She simply picked up the receipt. Thank you for filling the order, and she left. But the conversation stayed with her longer than she wanted it to. The real trouble arrived at the beginning of summer. A polished black carriage came down the road toward Red Willow Ranch, the kind of carriage that looked more comfortable on a city street than a dirt trail. Inside was William Prescott, a wealthy ranch owner from the eastern side of the valley. He arrived with papers, business proposals, and the confidence of a man used to being listened to. Thomas met him outside the main house. Clara saw them from the kitchen window. William looked over the ranch carefully. The land could become something much bigger, he said. Thomas folded his arms. What do you want? William smiled. A partnership. He explained his plan, more cattle, more land, more influence. Then came the condition. My family has always believed strong ranches are built through strong alliances. Thomas said nothing. William continued. My sister Rebecca would make a suitable wife for a man in your position. The silence that followed was heavy. Clara, standing inside the kitchen, only heard part of the conversation through the open window. She heard William say, "You need someone proper standing beside you." Then she heard nothing for a moment. The wind shifted. Thomas answered, but his voice was too low for her to hear. Clara stepped away from the window. She did not wait for the rest, because somewhere deep inside, the old fear had already awakened. The fear of being temporary. The fear of finally finding a place, only to discover it was never meant to be hers. That evening, Thomas came into the kitchen. Clara was quieter than usual. He noticed. He always noticed. You all right? She looked up. For a second, she almost told him. Almost asked what William had meant. Almost asked if she was only a passing chapter in his life. But she lowered her eyes. I'm fine. Thomas knew those words. He had heard them from himself for years, and he knew they were rarely true. Outside, the summer wind moved across Red Willow Ranch, the same ranch that had slowly become warmer, the same ranch where two lonely people had started believing, just a little, that they might belong. Neither of them knew that the hardest test was only beginning. After William Prescott left Red Willow Ranch, the quiet returned. But it was not the same quiet as before. Before, the silence between Thomas and Clara had felt peaceful. Now it felt careful, like both of them were walking around something neither wanted to touch. Clara continued her work. She woke before sunrise, she lit the stove, she prepared breakfast, she checked the supplies and wrote down what needed to be ordered from town. Nothing changed on the outside, but Thomas noticed. The small things were different. She no longer left his coffee beside the ledger before he entered the office. She no longer stayed on the porch when he came back from the fields. She smiled when spoken to, but it was a smile that belonged to a polite stranger. Thomas had spent most of his life reading weather. He knew when a storm was coming before the clouds gathered. and he knew something was coming now. One evening, he found Clara sitting at the kitchen table after everyone had gone to sleep. A small oil lamp burned beside her. In front of her was the same old suitcase she had carried into Red Willow months earlier. Thomas stopped in the doorway. For a moment he said nothing. The room was filled only with the sound of the clock on the wall. "Where are you going?" Clara froze. Her hand rested on the leather strap of the suitcase. Slowly, she looked up. "I haven't decided." Thomas stepped inside. "Then why is your bag packed?" Clara looked down. Because there was no easy answer, because the truth sounded too much like weakness. Finally, she said quietly, "Because sometimes it's better to leave before someone asks you to." The words landed harder than Thomas expected. He moved closer. "Who asked you to leave?" Clara looked at him. Nobody had ever asked her that before, not that way, not like her leaving was something that needed a reason. She took a breath. When people build a life around something they can't keep, they usually get hurt. Thomas stood still. The fire behind her reflected in his eyes. "Is that what you think this is?" Clara did not answer, and that was answer enough. The next morning, before Thomas could finish the conversation, a rider came through the front gate. It was Joseph Reed. Thomas's younger brother had not been back to Red Willow in years. He arrived wearing a city coat too fine for a ranch road, carrying a leather folder under his arm. Thomas met him near the barn. The two brothers exchanged a quiet greeting. But Joseph's expression was serious. "There is a problem." Inside the ranch office, Joseph placed several papers on the desk, old documents, receipts, loan records. Thomas read through them carefully. A portion of the ranch had been used as security years earlier when repairs were made after a harsh winter. Thomas had known about the debt, but he had not known the terms had changed. Joseph tapped the paper. "If this is enforced, we could lose the northern pasture." Thomas looked toward the window. The northern pasture was where the best cattle grazed. It was the land his father had worked, the land he had spent his life protecting. "How long?" Joseph lowered his voice. "Not long." The room became quiet. Then Joseph added, "William Prescott knows." Thomas looked up. He understood immediately. William had not come only with a business offer. He had come waiting for a weakness. By the end of the week, William returned. This time he did not come smiling. He came with papers. He met Thomas outside the ranch house while the workers watched from a distance. "I can solve your problem," William said. Thomas looked at the documents in his hand. "And the price?" William did not hesitate. "You already know, a marriage, a partnership, a deal that would keep Red Willow intact. But it would cost Thomas the one thing he had not expected to find again." William looked toward the house. "You're a practical man, Thomas. Don't let emotions ruin what you built." Thomas was quiet. For years he had believed the same thing, work first, feelings second. But then Clara came to Red Willow, and somehow, without trying, she had made the place worth fighting for. Thomas looked back at William. "I spent my whole life building this ranch," a pause. "But she is the reason it feels like home." William's expression hardened. "You're choosing a woman over everything you've worked for?" Thomas did not raise his voice. He simply answered, "I would rather lose every acre than lose the woman who made this place worth coming home to." The words carried across the yard. The ranch hands heard them. Sam Carter stood near the barn, his weathered face unreadable. But he nodded once, because he understood. Clara heard enough. Not all of it. Only the parts that frightened her. She heard about the debt. She heard William's offer. She heard Thomas say he would lose everything. And she made the decision she had been preparing herself to make since the day she arrived. She would leave, not because she stopped caring, because she cared too much. That night, Clara folded her dresses carefully. She placed the few personal items she owned into her suitcase. The room Thomas had repaired for her was quiet. The door closed firmly, a door no longer touched by the wind. She rested her hand on the handle. For a moment she almost stayed. Then she remembered every place she had once believed was permanent, every room she had decorated, every family she had served, every goodbye that came when she least expected it. Before sunrise, Clara walked past the kitchen. She left the key on the table. Then she walked toward the road, leading away from Red Willow Ranch. Behind her was the first home she had ever almost believed was hers. Ahead was another road, another place, another beginning. And she told herself the same thing she had told herself for years. It was better to leave before someone could ask her to go. The road away from Red Willow Ranch was quiet in the early morning, the kind of quiet that came before a town woke up. Clara walked beside the old wagon trail with her suitcase in hand, her dark coat pulled tightly against the cold spring air. Behind her, the ranch slowly disappeared into the distance. She did not look back, not because she did not want to, because she knew if she did, she might stop. And Clara Whitfield had spent too many years learning how to leave. By the time she reached the small train station outside Red Willow, the sun had risen above the mountains. The wooden platform was nearly empty. A few travelers waited with bags beside their feet. A railroad worker checked a pocket watch while smoke drifted from the engine in the distance. Clara placed her suitcase beside the bench. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel the weight of what she was leaving behind. The kitchen, the ranch hands, the repaired door. Thomas. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she heard footsteps. Not hurried, not angry, familiar. Clara. She turned. Thomas Reed stood at the edge of the platform. His coat was covered in dust from the road. His horse was tied near the station fence. He looked like a man who had ridden hard and had not stopped once to rest. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Thomas looked at the suitcase, then at her. You were really going to leave? Clara lowered her eyes. I thought it was the right thing. For who? The question was quiet, but it carried more weight than anger would have. Clara looked toward the tracks. For you. Thomas stepped closer. I never asked you to leave. No, she said softly. You didn't. The wind moved between them. That's what made it harder. Thomas did not understand at first. Then he did. She had not been afraid of losing a job. She had been afraid of finally having something worth losing. Thomas reached into his coat and pulled out a folded group of papers. He held them toward her. Clara looked at them, but did not take them immediately. What is that? The answer to William Prescott. She hesitated. Then she opened the papers. They were legal documents, property records, signed agreements. Her eyes moved slowly across the pages. Thomas had sold part of his personal cattle holdings to settle the old debt. The northern pasture would remain with Red Willow Ranch. But that was not the only thing. Clara looked up. Why is my name on this? Thomas was quiet for a moment, because the answer mattered, because he wanted her to understand, because you built more of that ranch than you realize. She looked back at the papers. A portion of the main house and the land around it had been legally assigned to her, not as a worker, not as someone staying temporarily, as someone who belonged. You did this before I left? Thomas nodded. I should have done it sooner. Clara's fingers tightened around the papers. Thomas, he looked toward the mountains behind the station. You keep thinking you're someone passing through. His voice became softer. But every morning those men wake up because you gave them a reason to care about this place. He looked back at her. You made Red Willow a home before you ever believed you had the right to call it one. The train whistle sounded in the distance. Clara looked toward the tracks, then back at Thomas. What happens if this costs you everything? Thomas did not answer immediately. The old Thomas would have talked about land, money, the ranch, the things he had spent his whole life protecting. But the man standing there now was different. I spent years thinking losing things was the worst thing that could happen. He paused. Then you came to Red Willow. Clara held her breath. And I realized the worst thing would be having something worth keeping and letting it walk away. The station became quiet. Even the sounds of the train seemed far away. Thomas stepped closer, not forcing, not asking, just standing there. You spent your whole life carrying names other people gave you. His voice lowered. But you deserve one that was chosen. Clara looked at him, the man who fixed her door, the man who noticed when she was cold, the man who had never once asked her to prove she belonged. Thomas took her hand, carefully, like he was holding something precious. You should carry my name, Clara. The words were simple, but they reached places in her heart that years of hardship had closed away. Not because she needed saving, not because she needed protection, because someone was finally saying, stay, not because of what you can do, not because you are useful, because you are you. When Clara returned to Red Willow Ranch with Thomas, the entire place was waiting. The ranch hands stood near the barn. Sam Carter stood at the front, his old hat in his hands. Clara looked surprised. Sam cleared his throat. Didn't think you'd leave without saying goodbye. A small smile touched her face. I thought I already did. The old cowboy shook his head. No. He looked toward the house. You don't say goodbye to a place that belongs to you. Behind him, the others nodded. For the first time, Clara saw it clearly. She had spent years wondering if she was allowed to stay. But everyone else had already made room for her. William Prescott arrived one final time. He stood outside the ranch office, expecting to find Thomas alone. Instead, he found Clara beside him. William looked at the documents, then at the ranch hands gathered nearby. He understood. The people he had underestimated were the very people holding Red Willow together. Sam stepped forward. She was the first person who treated us like we mattered. Nobody argued, because everyone there knew it was true. William looked at Clara. For once, there was no judgment in his expression, only a quiet understanding that some things could not be bought. The wedding took place in the small wooden church in Red Willow that summer. There were no grand decorations, no expensive flowers, just sunlight through old windows. Cowboys in clean shirts, neighbors filling the wooden benches. People who had watched Clara arrive with one suitcase now watched her stand beside the man who had given her a reason to unpack it. When the minister asked her name, Clara paused, not because she forgot, because she was remembering every place where she had never been asked who she truly was. Then she smiled. Clara Reed. And for the first time in her life, the name she carried was not borrowed, it was chosen. Years later, the dining room at Red Willow Ranch was still full every evening. Cowboys came through the door after long days. Young workers sat beside old ones. The same kitchen fire still burned. The same table still held more plates than anyone expected. One evening, a little girl looked around the crowded room and asked Clara, "Mama, why does everyone know this place?" Clara looked at the ranch outside the window, the fields, the mountains, the home she once believed she could never have. She smiled, because once this was just a ranch. She looked toward Thomas, who stood by the doorway watching her. Then someone decided it could become a home. And in the quiet valley of Wyoming, where the wind had once carried only loneliness, there was finally the place where Clara Whitfield Reed never had to wonder if she belonged. Imagine carrying a suitcase through years of your life, never knowing if the next door you walk through will truly open for you. Imagine building warmth for others, setting the table for strangers, caring for people who never stop to ask where you came from. Then imagine, after all that time, finding someone who does not ask what you can give, but simply asks you to stay. That was Clara's journey. She did not find a home because someone rescued her. She found one because someone finally saw the worth she had carried all along. And maybe that is what stays with us most about her story. Sometimes the greatest gift is not a new beginning, but the courage to believe we deserve one. Sometimes love is not about changing who we are. It is about finding the person who recognizes the parts of us that the world overlooked. If you had been in Clara's place, what would have been the hardest thing to leave behind? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if stories of love, healing, and forgotten hearts finding their way home speak to you, consider subscribing. There are more heartfelt journeys waiting ahead, with more mysteries, struggles, and moments of hope still to be discovered.